Hello everyone! We are going to start a new story. It is titled Hachiko Waits. This story is pretty good. We're going to be reading it for the next 3-4 weeks. What was I going to say? You have a vocabulary page that goes along with this, so make sure you're checking the resources for that. And then you have a journal question for each chapter. So if you have any questions about those, make sure you let me know, okay? Now, before you start reading, I want you to take a look at the book. I want you to make some predictions on what you think this book is about. Make some predictions on what you think this book is about. If you need to stop the video to do that, make sure you do it, okay? But just think about it. What do you think is going to happen? Now, this story is based on a true story, and there's also a movie of it. Now, the movie is a little bit different, so you'll have to, if you want to watch that, I would wait until after you finish the book. Okay. Chapter 1. When Professor Iceborough Uno woke up, he liked to play a game with his golden brown puppy, Hachi. He lay on his futon, not moving a muscle. He did not even open his eyes. Could he fool Hachi into thinking he was asleep? Not a chance. Hachi knew the instant his master was awake, and told him so by pushing his cold, wet nose into the professor's hand. Good morning, Hachi. The professor sat up and rubbed the soft patch of white fur that ran from the puppy's nose up between his eyes, and stopped just below his pointy ears. Did you sleep well, little friend? Hachi answered by wagging his fluffy curled tail back and forth with great enthusiasm. I'm glad you had such a fine night, the professor said, as he put on his glasses and rose from his silk sleeping mat. Now come along, Hachi. Let us start the day. He motioned to the puppy, who followed along as the professor washed himself, put on a dark blue kimono, and headed downstairs to eat the breakfast his housekeeper had prepared for him before she left for the marketplace. The professor entered the tatami room, walked across the straw mats covering the floor, and sat down on a cushion in front of the low wooden table. He poured himself a cup of hot green tea. As he lifted the steaming teacup, he looked up at the calendar hanging on the wall. The page it was turned to had a beautiful picture of a bright yellow sun rising over Japan. April 1st, 1924, the professor read out loud. It is going to be a good day, little friend. The professor said this every day. He was a man of habit. Professor Uno began to eat his breakfast of miso soup, dried fish, and seaweed rice, cooked eggs, and pickled radishes. His housekeeper had always set out the breakfast for Hachi, a bowl of rice with miso soup poured over it. Hachi went over to his bowl, sniffed at it once, and walked away. He sat at the doorway and gazed at his master with this pleading look in his dark brown eyes. The professor knew what Hachi wanted, but he shook his head. No, Hachi, you cannot have yakitori for breakfast, he said. Yakitori was the puppy's favorite meal. I will buy some for your supper tonight on my way home from the train station, and you can practice pulling the chicken off the skewers the way I taught you. Now eat your food. Hachi stayed where he was, and again the professor knew what he wanted. Hachi played this game with him every morning. He was a dog of habit. All right, Hachi. Professor Uno went over to the dog bowl and knelt down beside it. Mmm. The professor smacked his lips as he pretended to pick a little of the food out of the bowl and taste it. What delicious rice this is, Hachi. Come and try a bite here. He scooped up a tiny bit of rice from the index finger and held it out to Hachi. The dog licked his finger and began to eat. Did you enjoy your breakfast this morning? The professor asked when Hachi was done. Hachi looked up at him with 2 grains of white rice stuck to his wet black nose. The professor laughed. Let me wash your face, little friend. You cannot go around looking like that. He tenderly wiped the dog's muzzle with the corner of his napkin. What a handsome dog you are. Hachi sat up tall and straight, basking in his master's praise. The professor finished his tea and rose from his cushion. Now it is time for your lesson, Hachi. Come. Professor Uno walked in front of the entryway with Hachi at his heels. The genkan had a mat spread out along one path, with several pairs of the professor's shoes lined up neatly upon it. The professor stepped out of his house, slipped into house slippers and into a pair of geto, the wooden clogs he wore outside. Then together he and Hachi walked out of the house, across the front porch, and into the yard. "Look, Hachi," the professor pointed to a tree in the yard that was full of pink buds about to bloom. "Soon it will be time for our cherry blossom party." He took a few deep breaths, filling his lungs with fresh spring air, then turned to face his dog. "Let us begin," he said to the puppy. "Hachi, sit." The professor gave the command in a serious tone of voice, and Hachi immediately sat. "Good dog," said the professor. "Hachi, down!" Hachi lowered his body onto the ground, and again his master complimented him. "What a good dog you are!" The professor knelt down and rubbed the fur around Hachi's neck and shoulders. "What a smart dog you are, Hachi! What a clever dog you are!" Professor Uno praised Hachi in a high-pitched voice, as though he were talking to a baby. "We will try 2 more things." The professor stood up and lowered his voice. "Hachi, heel!" Professor Uno took a few steps around the garden, and Hachi followed him, keeping close to his left side. "Good dog, Hachi. Sit." Hachi did as he was told. "Now, Hachi, speak," said the professor. Hachi stared at him silently, his head tilted to one side. "Hachi, speak." The professor repeated the command, but Hachi remained silent. "One," Professor Uno demonstrated for him, yipping like a young puppy. But Hachi did not respond. The professor changed his bark. "One," he repeated it in the deep, growling voice of a large, angry dog. Hachi just looked at him. "All right," the professor shook his head. "It seems you have nothing to say today, and it is time for me to go teach my other students. Come inside." Professor Uno changed into a suit and tie and gathered his books and papers together. Then he walked down the hallway to the genkan and put on a pair of leather shoes. He left the house, and Hachi followed him to the front gate. "Hachi, sit," the professor said. "What a good dog you are." He bent down until he was almost nose to nose with the puppy. "What a fine dog you are," he said softly. "Hachi, you are the best dog in all of Japan." He gave Hachi a few soft pats on the head, kissed the tip of his nose, and stood up. "I will return at 3 o'clock. Farewell, little friend." The professor turned from Hachi and pulled open the latch. As he went to shut the gate, one of his books dropped on the ground. When the professor bent to pick it up, his glasses slipped down his nose, and some papers flew out of his arms. The wind blew them down the street, and he raced after them without closing the gate properly. Hachi nosed it open and ran to be with his master. "Hachi, how did you get out?" the professor asked. "You must go home now." The professor pointed toward the gate and spoke in a stern voice. But Hachi did not move. The professor took a step back towards the house, but Hachi did not follow. He sat down right where he was and stared at the professor. Professor Uno sighed and looked at his watch. "Hachi, I'm going to miss my train," he said. Hachi wagged his tail. The professor sighed again and shook his head. He never could stay mad at his puppy for long. "All right, little friend," he said, giving in. "Come on, heel." Overjoyed, Hachi spun around in a circle and then fell into step beside his master. Okay, that was chapter 1. Make sure you do the journal question, everybody. Bye-bye.